Hi, so this is going to be a quick little video tutorial on how to gesso this Bristol board paper with tinted gesso. So we're going to tint the gesso to a medium gray value, but before we do that, we need to make sure that this paper is fixed to our board. So you need a hard surface, you need some tape. I like to use this tape that has very low tack, so it's got the smooth surface. You want to tape this down so that when the paper begins to expand, it doesn't warp and it can settle back down. So this process of taping this paper down is called sizing. So we're going to size our paper down onto a surface that's hard, and then we'll be able to get started with our painting, with our gessoing, I mean. So the reason we do this is so that whatever we decide to paint on this surface with is going to have a barrier between the paper and the surface, so that the surface can last longer. Right? So once I've taped it down, I want to burnish the edges nice and tight so that none of the paint escapes out the edges and we keep a nice clean edge. Now if you want, you can measure all of this so have a nice little even border all the way around. I'm trying to make this a quick tutorial, but if you feel so inclined to do so, you can. So now basically it's ready to go. Now I use this cheap chip brushes. They're roughly somewhere around $1. Once you get most of the hairs out, wet it, smack it around a couple times, most of those loose bristles will come right out. I use this after I've done a couple coats, or even during the first coat. I use it to make sure I get rid of any brush strokes that I don't like from this. I want a nice, smooth, even surface. I don't want the brush strokes to dictate what my painting is going to look like. Okay, so right now I have this white gesso. I'm going to tint this white gesso with a little bit of Payne's gray. Now you don't want to go too much, or that value will be too dark and then it'll be difficult to get rid of it. So something like that on a cup like this, I think it's sufficient. We'll mix it up, see what it looks like. Now when you're mixing, you want to make sure that you mix it as thoroughly as possible. There's no marbleizing. So when it's not thoroughly mixed, it looks kind of like marble. Call that marbleizing. So you want to make sure that the paint or the gesso are thoroughly combined and you have no marbleization. So how do you know what gray is a good gray? It all depends what it is that you're going to paint. So in general, we want to keep to roughly number 5, if you were to think of a value scale with 9 steps. Roughly a number 5 value, a number 4 value would be good. Number 6 is also fine. Alright, what you don't want is too dark, and also what you don't want is too light. So I think that value is giving us about value 6. So thinking that 0 is black, this gives us around a value 6. Now once this dries, it's going to dry a little darker, and we want to make sure that we mix enough so that we have enough to do at least 3 coats on this paper. Now with 3 coats of gesso and sanding in between, this sheet of gesso, gessoed Bristol board, should be able to also take oil paints without deteriorating much. Alright, so you don't add any water to this. Now as we apply this, we want to make sure that we go in sort of like an X pattern. So something like that. Now what this will do is ensure that you're getting an even coverage all the way through. And I'll just keep going down. The sheet of paper. Now the more practice you get with this, the easier this process will become. And then I'll show you guys what I will do with this foam brush to then get rid of all these all the texture that these bristles are creating. You want to make sure that you jam it into the corners, jam it into the edges. You have a nice even surface. And any little bits of hair or anything like that you can easily remove. Now we want to make sure that this doesn't dry up, so you can wrap it up in plastic and then wait for this to dry so we can give it a second coat. And before we give it a second coat, want to just sand in between. So with this process, I'm just gliding this foam brush across just to get rid of any or too much texture. You want to make sure that this dries and is ready to give a second coat in just a couple minutes. This should dry fairly quickly if the temperature in your room is not too humid, very dry. This should dry quickly. And I can see a couple little spots, and I want to just hit real quick before I let this just sit and dry, and that'll give it ready for the next coat. So once this dries, I want to go over the entire surface with sandpaper. This sandpaper is 150 grit, so it's not too coarse, not too smooth. I go over the surface just to create an abrasion so as to allow the next layer of gesso to adhere adequately to the previous layer. If you have a couple little spots, that's okay. With the next coat, you'll definitely take care of that. Hit it the second coat, same thing, and then sand in between. Your third coat, soften your bristles, your marks, and then one more last sanding, and it should be ready to go.